Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our weekly Sunday school lesson. I am Elder Latanya Milliken of the All Nation Pentecostal Church in Oakland, California, and my pastor is Bishop Terrence L. Milliken, and this is lesson 2 in the fall quarter for the adult Sunday school. And you are welcome to share this video with all of your friends and family. Before we get into our lesson, I want to invite you to our weekly services at 11 a.m. on Sunday morning. The address is 5815 San Pablo Avenue, Oakland, California. Church started at 11 o'clock. You're welcome. We will be social distancing, sitting and worshiping 6 feet apart. It's a very condensed service, but it's just really good to be among the saints. And we are requiring masks as well. But if your church or if you're just longing for an experience, come and fellowship with us on Sunday morning. So let's get to our lesson today. The death of Nadab and Abihu. And so I'm going to give you the historical real quick. Basically, the children of Israel are 3 months out from leaving Egypt. So the Lord delivered them from Egypt. They traveled to Mount Sinai. It took them about 3 months. They settled at the base of Mount Sinai, and God is beginning to instruct them. And when we think about the book of Leviticus, the book of Leviticus shares with us, it's an extensive guidebook on how showing God's people how to have a relationship with Him and how to have a relationship with others, and how to come into His presence and how to devote their lives to Him. And so that's what we find in the book of Leviticus. It's one of the first 5 books of the Bible, the beginnings. And so God is, the children of Israel, they are a really young nation at this time, and God is teaching them how to have a relationship with Him. And so that's very important. It's important to know that God is a holy God, and He expected them to be holy back then and today. A little more about that later. So let's see. Last week we talked about the ordination of the priest. Aaron, Moses' brother, was the first high priest. So if you ever get that in a trivia question, who was the first high priest? Aaron. And his sons were priests as well. In order to be a priest going forward, you had to be a descendant of Aaron. And so what we're seeing here is a transitioning from Moses being the mediator to the priest, and the priesthood becoming the mediator between God and man. Now, Moses was still the leader, but we're seeing some growth here. We're seeing some transitioning and some more authority given. And so if you were with us last week, we walked you through the ordination where they had to be washed and robed. And I'm sure we're going to learn more and more about the role as we continue. So that was last week. This week, we see some of the duties being performed and in the priesthood. So Aaron's 2 older sons are performing worship. And so let's read a little bit and see what happens in our lesson this week. So if you have your Bibles, Leviticus, the 10th chapter, I will begin reading at the first verse, and I will be reading from the Way. You get your favorite translation and you can read along. If not, you can just read along. I'm going to read the first through the 3rd verse verbatim and then paraphrase the 4th through the 7th verse. So let's begin to read. Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, put coals of fire in their incense burners and sprinkle incense over them. In this way, they disobeyed the Lord by burning before Him the wrong kind of fire, different than He had commanded. So fire blazed forth from the Lord's presence and burned them up. And they died there before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord meant when He said, I will display my holiness through those who come near me. I will display my glory before all the people. And Aaron was silent. Again, and Aaron was silent. And so the 4th verse through the 7th verse, Moses instructed whose cousins? Aaron's cousins to come and remove the bodies. They were not priests. They were instructed to come move the bodies, and so they came, did what Moses had instructed them, and then Moses instructed Aaron that he and his sons that were priests could not mourn for the two that had disobeyed God. They could not do the rituals that they do to mourn, like rip their clothes, don't comb their hair. They had to show respect for God's decision by not mourning their relatives, but their distant relatives could mourn, and the people could mourn. And lastly, Moses instructed Aaron that he could not leave the tabernacle because he was anointed with the anointing oil, and they obeyed him. And so that's the reading of the lesson. And so let's kind of go in to a couple of the references and then we'll get to the heart of the lesson. And so we primarily, the boys, we don't really know. Well, we kind of have an idea that, well, we know that they presented the wrong offering or sacrifice. So we don't know all of the details. I do remember this story when I was young. I never really got the gist of what really happened, but this lesson has allowed me to kind of do a deep dive and understand that they die. All I remember is that, oh, they did the sacrifice and then they got burnt up. And I'm like, oh, how that's horrible, right? But the truth of the matter is that they did the sacrifice, but they were disobedient. They were blatantly disobedient to the instructions that God had given them. Now, the Lord had ordained them priests and given them instructions. What do you think happened? I mean, what do you think happened? Do you think they wasn't paying attention? That's a possibility. Or maybe they just felt like they could do it the way they wanted to do it. Or they just wanted to do a shortcut and get it over with. This lesson is to teach us that you have to follow God's instructions. When you come into his presence, you have to follow his instructions. And so let's talk a little bit about clean and unclean. Okay. And so when you think about clean and unclean, in order to come into God's presence, people, animals, or objects, they had to be clean. God had instituted, rituals to make things clean. Now, when we go back to last week's lesson, you remember that Moses had to wash Aaron and had to wash his sons in order to clean them. So then you have to be clean when you come into God's presence. And when we think about clean, it has nothing to do with hygiene. Let me just repeat that. It has nothing to do with hygiene. Okay? And so when you think about clean, the distinction between this cleanness is ethical character and behavior. Ethical character and behavior that is acceptable to God is clean. What's unacceptable is things that are not clean, like sin. And so a person's character, which comes from his heart, determines whether you're clean or unclean. And so God is God is really concerned about how we worship. And when we worship God the way we want to worship God, then we corrupt worship. But we have to follow God's instructions. Just like the priest had to follow God's instructions, we have to follow God's instructions when we want to come into his presence. So we can't do it the way we want to. Oh my God, I can remember a lot of arguments with the praise and worship team. Whoo! But we cannot do it the way we want. I think if you just if you sing a hymn together and your heart is right, you're doing okay. But that's my thoughts. So there's some key points here in our lesson. One, you must worship God the right way. All right. So the sons offered an unauthorized fire to the Lord, a strange fire, a profane fire. Now, I don't know specifically what their intentions were. I don't know if they were lazy or if it was a lack of respect or if it was just this cavalier approach. But they disrespected God's holiness and he struck them dead. This seems harsh, don't it? It seems harsh. But God is in his right to punish sin. And so what he was doing, this was a young nation. This was a young nation, and God was trying to teach them that sin he was teaching them the price of sin. And so I was thinking about this lesson. I was studying this lesson, and I thought about as a parent, you have a small child and you teach them instructions. You teach them instructions, one, so they don't harm themselves, right? So two, when they get of age, they won't harm themselves, right? They won't lose their freedom and they won't lose their lives. We teach our kids when they're young so that they will be safe, so they make safe decisions and safe choices, and so they will be happy and not ultimately be penalized for wrongdoing or harmful things that could be done. So one, again, we must worship God right. Second, we must put God first. So Aaron lost his sons. And so Moses reminded him and reminded his other brothers that you are now priest. You accepted this calling. You must do it the right way, right? And so Aaron, I'm sure, was reflecting on the tragedy of the golden calf. Or he probably reflected on the time when people had died from sin. So Moses was having this conversation with Moses is having this conversation with Aaron and his sons and saying, you can't mourn. You've got to respect, which is number 3, respect the Lord's judgment. Why? Because they were priests. If the priest didn't follow God's instructions, what would the people do? As a leader, if you deviate this much, those that are following you will deviate this much. If you deviate from the truth, from the process, from the policies, from all of legalities. If you deviate this much, then they will deviate this much. And then we'll have what? Chaos. And so Moses reminded Aaron about God's faithfulness to his word. God is faithful to his word. He expected Moses and Aaron's sons to show respect to God's judgment and not mourn visibly. God was making a holy nation to reveal his glory to the world. This was important. Their behavior was important. The people were going to see the priests, and the world was going to see the people. How were the people supposed to learn how to respect God's holiness if the priests could not? So I've got some things that I want to read to you as I wrap this up. So Moses, there you go again, Tan. Aaron could not mourn his sons. He had to show that he was in agreement to God's decision to discipline his sons when they disobeyed him. What were they thinking? What are we thinking? I'll drop my glasses. What are we thinking when we disobey God? God is a holy God. He expects us to obey him. He expects us to be holy like he is holy. Free from sin. We must live free from sin. We must come into his presence with a clean heart. We must worship him the way he has instructed us to worship. We can't worship the way we want to. We can't come to God the way we want to. I always say, if you want things to go your way, then create your own world. If you don't want to follow the rules and regulations on your job, then start your own business. So let's wrap this lesson up. I'm sorry, I got to get my glasses. Let me read this because there's some really good things here. The writer of the lesson says here, we often have a hard time seeing the continuity between God in the Old Testament and the God in the New Testament. But even in the New Testament, God commands that we follow him wholeheartedly and put our love for him even above our families. This is what was happening. This is what was happening in our story. Aaron had to put his love of God and the ways of God above his family. God has always demanded and will continue to demand wholehearted worship.